Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about Skaven army compositions in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. It is a bit tricky to talk about the Skaven just because of the sheer differences between Legendary Lords, as well as the fact that Skaven don't really have a tier 1 roster worth recruiting, pretty much ever, but they can get to tier 5 even, fairly quickly in the course of their campaign using their food mechanics. So making army rosters for them is a bit tricky. Though, just because you can get to tier 5 does not mean you'll be able to recruit tier 5 units. You won't have the money for it. I do think Skaven do have a fairly interesting situation in recruitment, because technically they can recruit much better units than anyone else, but their early game units are not especially great. So I don't think it's ever worth talking about recruitment of tier 1 units unless you absolutely have nothing else to recruit. So basically the first 2 turns of your campaign you might be recruiting some Skaven slaves and clan rats, but outside of that you would just look to replace those as quickly as possible and move on to proper unit recruitment. And speaking about Skaven armies, what should you be looking to get? Well, very early on in your campaign, unless you're playing Ekikla, and that is the exception because he has an objective to unlock a higher level lab by getting specifically a Warlock Master to a certain level. But unless you're looking for that objective, you would want to get a Master Assassin. The reason you want to get the Master Assassin is he's better at ambushing, so Skaven have stock stand, so having a Lord that gives you that kind of ambush benefit is pretty substantial. He also buffs Night Runners and Gutter Runners in terms of their ability in battle. Then you have Assassin heroes and Chieftain hero options. So Assassins, the main reason you bring Assassins is because they give you casualty replenishment. It's not really their combat ability, it's the utility that they provide in the campaign. This is the norm with a lot of casualty replenishment heroes. Like, there are some that are really useful outside of just giving you casualty replenishment, but the Assassin hero, I would not consider one of those. But still, you need them. You need at least one of these in every army. Then you have Chieftains. Chieftains are actually pretty solid in battle, pretty decent heroes to have in a Skaven campaign, and you can get a lot of these fairly quickly in a Skaven campaign. Now, as for the army itself, well, you do have some support units and then the mainline army you should go for. So support unit-wise, you would have Warp Grinders. Now, Warp Grinders, you should not consider them a mainline unit. They're a support unit. They have a couple of useful abilities. They can do Vanguard deployment. They have Wall Breaker. They don't use ammo. So being able to destroy enemy walls with a unit that doesn't use ammo and just goes up to a wall and just starts destroying it is exceptionally useful. But they're not really a mainline combat unit. They're there to support the army. They have decent stats, leadership, all that kind of stuff, and a decent amount of weapon strength, but they are lacking in melee defense and melee attack. Ekikla does have a way of buffing these guys up by quite a bit, but still. You do have 2 useful abilities, so Seismic Snare, which prevents enemies from moving, and then Warp Quake, which does damage and reduces their speed. So they're useful to support an army in a field battle. With those kind of abilities, they're exceptionally useful in sieges, and you will have plenty of those to deal with. Another support unit are the Warp Fire Throwers. A pretty decent level of durability, not great in a melee fight, similar to the Warp Grinders, though at least the Warp Grinders have a good amount of melee damage. Warp Fire Throwers don't. But they are your flamethrower. They reduce enemy leadership, they have magical attacks, flaming attacks, so they're pretty useful to have. They can do a lot of damage to an enemy army. How many of these you want is dependent on how many you're willing to micro. I would say 2 in general is fairly easy to manage. Anything more than that can be a bit of a hassle. And getting more than 2, well, let's just say there are better units you can use in higher quantities later on in a campaign. Then you have your mainline army. I'll talk about the clan rat clan rats with spears in just a moment. Well, the units you want to recruit very early on in a campaign are Night Runners and Night Runners with slings. What's the difference between these units? Well, if we look at a Night Runner, a regular Night Runner is a skirmish infantry unit. So what you do in Night Runners, they have the ability of firing while moving. They might not win melee fights against most other units early on, or they'll trade evenly. Like if I get these guys to attack these clan rats, right? They wouldn't necessarily win that fight by an overwhelming amount. But they're faster than most other units, and they have enough ammunition and ranged attack damage that they'll significantly weaken anything that they're dealing with. So even in a situation like this, let's say there was an equal number of Night Runners and Clan Rats over here, the Clan Rats, the Clan Rats will lose that engagement. Because before the Night Runners even enter melee range, they'd be taking at least some level of damage. And then, while in certain respects, Night Runners are not as durable as Clan Rats, they do have physical resistance. They have better leadership. They can be more vulnerable to mass ranged attacks, to be sure, at least against the shielded version of Clan Rats. But effectively, Night Runners in field battles are the unit you want to go for, because of their constant attacks. Now, what about Night Runners with slings? Well, Night Runners with slings are not going to be able to fire while moving. Keep in mind, they still do have vanguard deployment, physical resistance. But what's important to understand is they're your primary ranged unit. And a more regular ranged unit. Now, the reason you want these guys is because siege situations, choke point situations, where just basically Night Runners can't go. And besides, Night Runners with slings will kill an enemy in ranged long before they might enter melee, and whereas regular Night Runners will run out of ammunition reasonably quickly. There are ways to improve that situation for a Skaven, to be sure, but it is worth understanding the kind of limitations you do have with regular Night Runners. Because by the way, if you just charge Night Runners into Clan Rats, yes, the trade there won't necessarily be good. But even in a direct charge situation, they'll still do pretty decently. So it isn't something to be ignored about them. And this is a reason why I find Clan Rats to be so worthless. Because in a straight-up melee fight, the trade is pretty even. Clan Rats may win a direct melee trade, but you're never going to use Night Runners from a direct melee trade perspective against any foe. So that is something worth pointing out about that situation. Also, it has to do with the way battles are won in Total War. So battles are won because of balance of power. This is your value against enemy value. And so what you want to do is take as few casualties as possible while inflicting as much damage. Night Runners can do that. Clan Rats and Skaven Slaves can't. Slingers can to an extent, but they're just far worse than Night Runner Slingers. The only Clan Rat unit you may want are Clan Rat Spears with shields. And this is to offer some level of flank protection. Mind you, it won't be good flank protection, but to offer you some level of flank protection for your weapon teams in a battle. So they do have a bronze shield, 25 armor, decent level of melee defense, all things considered, bonus versus large, and crucially they have charge reflection and charge defense versus large. So if enemy cavalry is a problem, because cav will catch up to Night Runner, so if enemy cav is a problem, if you're, say, dealing with Bretonia, the Night Runners would devastate Knights Errant, but if you're dealing with quite a few fast movers, having some Clan Rats with spears can be useful in that context, and you would want the building, if only to get the Chieftain hero in a Skaven campaign. But that is your very early game Skaven army that you should go for. So Night Runners, Warp Grinders, Warp Firefighters, Clan Rat Spears and Shields, and these 2 heroes. All of this available at tier 2, and you get that very, very quickly. In fact, you can get that on turn 1, get to tier 2 on turn 1, regardless of which campaign we're talking about. And then it just takes 2 turns to construct some of these buildings to start getting these units. And Skaven do have a huge capacity of recruiting units very quickly. Still staying in the early game, you do have the natural upgrades to Night Runners, which are Gutter Runners. Just flat out a better unit when you're looking at them. They have the Snare Net. They still have Firewall Moving, Physical Resistance available to them. But they're just flat out the better unit and are absolutely worth recruiting in a Skaven campaign. They do require tier 3 unless you're playing as Snitch, but yeah, Skaven can get to tier 3 pretty damn quickly. And then you have Gutter Runner Slingers. Same principle, same situation, same dynamic if you're dealing with that. Oh, and just worth pointing out over here that these guys will defeat Clan Rats in a regular melee fight very, very easily. Storm Vermin, I'll be as frank as possible. Storm Vermin are not worth recruiting in a campaign unless you're playing Queek, and only once you've gotten his special skill line, and only once you've really gotten Caracade Peaks. That is the only kind of dynamic in which you should recruit Storm Vermin in a Skaven campaign. Outside of that, you do keep the Warp Grinders, you keep your Warp Fire Throwers, and you would keep a Night Runner army. You wouldn't look to just get rid of them. By the way, they're gonna route here because they're getting a bunch of leadership benefits from the units around them, so their morale isn't breaking. Whereas mine, yeah, being isolated. This is one of the things you never want to send units isolated on their own, because otherwise, like, they would have broken if they were on their own there. Still, in terms of other units, you would get Plague Catapults. And you might ask, where's the Engineer? Well, Skaven have a bit of a problem with getting a bunch of Engineers early on. They can get Plague Claws, sure, they can start getting Artillery, but actually getting the Engineers to support them is a bit of an annoyance. And generally speaking, you want that Engineer to be with your Legendary Lord, not with your other armies. The thing about Plague Claws, they're pretty inaccurate as far as an artillery piece is concerned, but the amount of damage they can do if they do hit, they're not as bad as mortars, and they do more damage than Empire mortars, but it's that kind of same dynamic. If it hits, it's good, but it may not hit, and that's kind of the problem with Plague Claws. They do get the job done, you do want them, you know, knocking down walls, knocking down towers, all that kind of stuff, or static defenders on the wall, as opposed to, you know, using Gutter Runner Slingers and all that. But all the same, that's the kind of situation. This is the kind of army to go for when you're still in the early game. Keep in mind, like, even though we're talking about tier 3 units over here, this is still very early game. Like, we're talking just a couple of turns in a Skaven campaign if you've maximized your food and gotten a tier 3 settlement very, very quickly. This is what you should be aiming for to get in that situation in a Skaven campaign. Now, looking at the mid-game for Skaven, and yes, I know that it sounds crazy to consider a tier 4 army as the mid-game, but Skaven just roll like that. But looking at the mid-game, you would still keep the Warp Grinders, but outside of that, if you're recruiting a new army, you would basically keep nothing else of what you have early on. Artillery-wise, you would get Warp Lightning Cannons. The reason you would get Warp Lightning Cannons versus Plague Claws is, yeah, Plague Claws can do a lot of damage, but by this point in a campaign, you can get a lot of different things that can do a lot of damage. The important thing that Warp Lightning Cannons offer is they're anti-large, so single entities, and they'll be pretty good in terms of artillery duels, because they do have that kind of level of accuracy to their shots that, well, let's just say that something like a Plague Claw could never match. Don't expect them to do as much army damage, but again, you will have other ways of getting that. Or you could just keep the Plague Claws if you want to. You do keep the Warp Grinders, because Wall Breaker is still a very powerful ability, and yeah, their abilities are still useful, though you could also get rid of them if you want to. But the one benefit that Warp Grinders do have is they're a heavily armored unit, And one of the things to be said about this entire army is it's actually one of the few armies that Skaven have that's really good in auto-resolve, because the vast majority of units here have a pretty good level of armor. Hero-wise, you would still not really be able to get a bunch of engineers at this point, so you need even a higher tier. Yeah, Skaven engineer situation is a bit annoying. But you can get pack masters, and pack masters are pretty useful in a battle scenario, considering what they have on offer. Just in general, a really good support melee hero that can help you out, give you some more flexibility in the battlefield. And then you also have Plague Priests as well. So yeah, more melee heroes, get as many melee heroes, different capabilities, magic, if you will, from Plague Priests. I mean, the problem is, like, in skirmish, you're not really fully appreciating the actual power that these things have in an actual kind of battle scenario. And then we have the main course, if you will. Rattling Gunners, Deathglow Bombardiers, Jezzails, and Poison Wind Mortars. Now, Jezzails, I don't think I need to explain what Jezzails do. They're your long-range sniper units. Now, gunpowder units in general can struggle in quite a few different battles, and of course Jezzails do have issues in sieges. This is why it's so important to have Warp Grinders, because guess what those things are going to do. But Jezzails are meant to be long-range snipers against the enemy. The damage they do won't be the most significant, and you do have to worry about terrain, but 2 Jezzails are going to do a pretty solid job. Then you have your Deathglow Bombardiers and Poison Wind Mortars. Well, let me just give you an idea of what Poison Wind Mortars do in a battle. There are a few units I'm terrified of facing in a battle, but this is one of them. The reason is that they fire and your units cease to exist, basically. Like, when you're fighting Skaven that have these guys, it's like you can avoid Plague Claws potentially and neutralize them. These guys, though, are pretty durable, and they're probably going to be well protected by a bunch of different things. Bombardiers do have a more limited range, but they can also do a phenomenal level of damage, though in a bit of a different way. But yeah, just suffice to say that when Bombardiers fire at the unit in range, like, these guys are longer range. Like, consider these guys more like a shotgun unit, and this more like a mid-range artillery unit. And I think that's probably the best way to view it. There's just differences in the way the unit works, but both of them are pretty much worth it. As for Rattling Gunners, let's talk about Rattling Gunners. Rattling Gunners are a sustained damage unit, so they can do a lot of damage, but you gotta keep in mind how gunpowder units are limited. That's the reason I don't prefer massing them. If you can get them firing continuously at an enemy, they will do a lot of damage. Significant levels of damage, but you need to have that kind of favorable battle situation in order for that to work. They're not going to be great in sieges. That's the reason you don't want to mass too many of these Rattling Gunners, even as Ekakla. Because like they do suffer a lot because of ranged unit issues, terrain issues, limitations of gunpowder units. And then finally we have our Rat Ogres. Not the most durable units, but they're pretty solid flankers. Like, Skaven don't have artillery, don't have cavalry, but they do have Rat Ogres. And just like Ogres are pretty good charge units, well, so are Rat Ogres pretty solid chargers. So sadly enough, they don't have the Ogre charge, but still. This is the one unit you would actually want to recruit, if you even recruit it. Like, you could just decide, okay, I'm not going to recruit Rat Ogres or any monster units until I get to the really, really good stuff later on. Truth be told, in terms of monster units, I would say, like, it's only Rat Ogres and Mutant Rat Ogres that are worth recruiting. We'll get into that in just a moment. But yeah, this is the kind of, like, tier 4 army, if you will, for a Skaven that I'd be looking to recruit. Like, I know you can get Rat Ogres reasonably quick in a Skaven campaign. I just don't find it valuable to get them because their durability, like they're a flank unit, they're not a stand and fight unit. They're kind of like trolls. They're much better than trolls in terms of damage dealing capability, but they're worse in terms of survivability or versus stone trolls. So keep those kind of limitations in mind. You don't want to mass monstrous units. Now, as far as endgame Skaven armies are concerned, it is going to depend on what you're dealing with. Personally, I do prefer going for more versatile armies that can deal with different kinds of foes as opposed to one pony trick type army situation, though I think a lot of people do prefer the one pony trick thing. One of the things to mention about Skaven is that they can get a lot of heroes in their campaigns. Maybe not a lot of engineers, but everything else, yeah, you can make an entire chieftain, packmaster, and plague priest army, or several of them, or all of them, just being hero doomstacks. I do find that it does have some limitations, but hero-wise, you may use one of each hero type, like you have here, like one Plague Priest, one Warlock Engineer. Yes, at this point, at tier 5, is when you can really start massing Warlock Engineers. And obviously you do want them for any kind of ranged army. It doesn't matter what that ranged army is. It can be an artillery army, it can be a gutter runner army. It's irrelevant. You want a Warlock Engineer. You still want a Chieftain, because he does help protect your Lord, very importantly. You still may benefit from a Packmaster, though I'd say the Plague Priest and Packmasters are the ones that you can get rid of. Then you have your Eshin Sorcerers. So, Eshin Sorcerers are basically your mages. Now, Skaven do have access to magic in other ways, like with Lords, with other heroes to a degree or another, but Eshin Sorcerers are your dedicated caster heroes. So you do get a good variety of spells between things like Armor of Darkness, increasing armor and missile resistance, or the Black Whirlwind ability. So you do have those kind of spells available with an Eshin Sorcerer. Though you are going to have to dedicate money to getting these guys, because you don't actually need the building for anything else other than Eshin Sorcerers, because Death Runners, I would say they're kind of not worth it. What you might ask, well, what about Eshin Triads? Those are just like a limited support unit, and, well, let's just say I prefer Warp Grinders because Wall Breaker is Wall Breaker. So, some Rattling Gunners, some Giselles, some Death Globes, some Poison Wind Mortars, though the ratio of artillery to infantry, that's, you know, dependent on what you're dealing with, and if you can get away with it. Like, if you're dealing with an entire Bretonnian army, yeah, you may not want so much. Just keep that in mind. So, one hero of each type, you start getting Warlock Engineers, and by the way, with Warlock Masters, we gotta talk a bit about Doomflayers and Doomwheels. I don't think either Doomflayers or Doomwheels are generally worth getting, though if you're gonna get any of them, even as a mount option, I would prefer the Doomflayer. It's more nimble, it's generally gonna be able to get you in and out. Doomwheels are just slower, bigger target, and they do seem to handle worse in auto-resolve. So if you're gonna recruit any unit, I'd recruit Doomflayers, but I'd probably not focus on any of those. Outside of that, you do have your Mutant Rat Ogre. So Mutant Rat Ogres, their durability is not necessarily that exceptional, because, you know, armor is still not great, but they do have a bunch of different benefits. So they do have Frenzy, they do have Siege Attacker, they do cost Error against the enemy. So these are just really, really good to have in a battle. Because due to their size, they're not really big for a single entity monster, so they're actually protected against enemy range units just because of their smaller size. And, well, ogres are ogres, right? Think of these guys as infantry killers, or just like the kind of unit you can throw in the middle of an army and they will be able to do a pretty decent job. Though you may skip these guys if you want to. Like, if there's anything skippable in this army, it is these guys. Keep in mind, I am charging Clan Rat Spears right there, so it does show you the limitation. But they're more of a damage unit than anything else. They're not a unit that's gonna sustain itself very well. Your heroes are the ones that can take a lot of the damage in a Skaven campaign. Now, you may be asking about things like Storm Vermin. Well, let me put that as bluntly as I can. I think Storm Vermin in 99% of cases or 90% of cases are not worth recruiting. The only context is with Queek. Once you get Carricade Peaks in his campaign. But then you realize what Queek is dealing with. Why fight dwarves and chaos dwarves or greenskins in melee when you can blast them from range? And that is fundamentally the reason Storm Vermin are not worth recruiting in the campaign, even with all the significant buffs that Queek does offer. I'd probably get like 2 of them, but more so to just replace like Rat Ogres and Mutant Rat Ogres, flank protection, support, everything else in an army. But this is one option of an in-game Skaven army that I would go with. You could remove some of the heroes, get more range capability, just be aware of the consequences if you do so in that situation. Now, as far as an alternative is concerned for the Skaven, you would still keep Assassin Heroes, Ashen Sorcerers, Chieftains, and of course Warlock Engineers. Like, there is no Skaven army which doesn't benefit from a Warlock Engineer. And go with a significant amount of Gutter Runner Slingers and regular Gutter Runners with Poison. Slingers for sieges or just stand-up range capability, and regular Gutter Runners for field battles. Pretty quick, poison attacks do slow down the enemy, so the enemy is, like, even cavalry would struggle to actually catch these guys if they're trying to do so. And then, yes, some Warp Lightning Cannons and Poison Wind Mortars for range capability, as well as having some Ashen Triads as opposed to Warp Grinders for protection of your artillery. Though you could still use Warp Grinders and just ignore the Ashen Triads. They're useful for the sake of flank protection because of their charge reflection, physical resistance, charge defense versus large, but Warp Grinders are, like, with this kind of army, let's just say if cavalry's coming even remotely close to you, they're probably already damaged. So Warp Grinders should be able to handle even things like Rain Lights, assuming they've been weakened enough. And this is an army that's especially good if you're playing as Snitch. Though, keep in mind the one downside of an army like this. While in field battles, it does have a flexibility that a Rattling Gunner Giselle army doesn't have, flat out doesn't have. It is a bad army in terms of auto-resolve, which does matter when you're playing a lot of those battles. So unless you're willing to fight every battle manually, yeah, you might have some problems with using this army. But really effective in field battles, really maneuverable, will handle more battlefields better. I mean, you could just have an army like this supporting an army like the one that I showed, like the Giselle Rattling Gunner army. You could even go with more Giselles and Rattling Gunners if you have 2 armies supporting one another. And Skaven, in terms of ambush situations, few factions are going to be able to catch the Skaven in an ambush kind of situation, because Skaven, yeah, they're the master ambusher race in a campaign. So just keep that specific aspect in mind in a kind of campaign situation, campaign dynamic that you might be dealing with. So that is my perspective with regards to Skaven armies. It's really, the question is more so about, in terms of recruitments, like what can you afford, what buildings, how many different types of buildings are we gonna get? Like, getting the Gutter Runner building and the Chieftain building is always worth it. Getting the Warp Grinder building is always worth it, because, you know, flamethrowers themselves are very good early game units. But after that, it's really gonna be up to you, like, what can you afford and at what point in a campaign. With regards to things like Brew Horrors and Hell Pit Abominations, I just don't think they're worth the cost that you're paying for them, from my perspective. At least from a campaign perspective. Like, I would rather get more Mutant Rat Ogres than get a single Hell Pit Abomination. But that's my personal perspective on that subject. Let me know what you guys think. Also, just keep in mind something. One of the reasons I push Gut Runners and Night Runners and all that is not just because the units themselves inherently versus Clan Rats, it's also the kind of upgrades you can get, like when you have them led by a Master Assassin, research you can get, skill lines you can get. An army is not just dictated by, like, how the units are inherently, but also the kind of upgrades that you can easily acquire for them. And that's one of the significant advantages with, like, Gut Runners and Night Runners. Whereas the artillery army is more of an investment, and it does take a while until you really see the full potential, unless you're Ikeclaw. But even then, you know, cost concerns are going to be a problem early on for him in his campaign. And also the kinds of enemies that he's dealing with, because, you know, Wood Elves have his number. Costin here, signing out. Stay tuned for more.